Hi guys, Claudia Boleyn here, and today's video is sort of like an old school response to a documentary kind of thing. You might have seen it, you might not. So the documentary I'm kind of responding to, or maybe kind of continuing a conversation, I guess. It's on BBC iPlayer and it's called David Baddiel, Social Media, Anger and Us. Now, the reason I was watching this is I'm not a fan of David Baddiel. Like, I honestly don't like his politics. I find him very, very central, and a lot of stuff has been quite questionable. But I was very, very interested in this documentary, maybe almost on another level to how it was intended. Because this documentary is supposed to be focusing on if social media is making us more angry, you know, more violent, if people are more divided than ever, like what the platforms, like what responsibility the platforms have in that, like the feeling surrounding that. That was the intention. But actually something I took from this documentary, like accidentally, was this interesting study of a person who has had quite a successful career on the BBC and been platformed. Quite a centrist / liberal figure in the BBC. So there's a lot of those sort of people around. And it's very, very interesting to me because we are battling these different issues. And obviously I have a lot of like opinions on this because I've been active on this channel since I was like 19 years old. So I kind of have a lot to say about the good and bad of social media. But what's so interesting was seeing it channeled and filtered through the lens of somebody that did have quite a big platform, quite a mainstream platform. So obviously the BBC, if you pay your TV licence, you know, if you have a television and you pay your licence, like, you can get the BBC. So it's one of like the main 4 channels, even if you didn't have like Freeview or Sky or anything like that. It's one of the big ones. So first of all, that was very interesting to me because what I'll get into in this video is that the takes that he has, I find so fascinating because I feel like people in that situation are not meaning to, but they're managing to somehow make themselves the centre of something, and I don't even know if they quite understand what they're doing, but I found the way this whole thing was framed was actually quite dangerous to minorities and the actually vulnerable people out there, but not in an intentional way, if that makes sense. I'm going to get into this, but something that I have seen a lot before I get into some of this stuff directly is that you'll often see celebrities that kind of have done quite well in quite a mainstream public platform, and now they're faced with something like Twitter. So obviously with something like Twitter, with the rise of social media, what it means is that more people have access to a platform. And at the heart of it, I don't know if a lot of them even like can accept this, but this is my perception of what a lot of people are saying. I think in their hearts and in their minds, I think maybe deep down, it worries them a little bit because they're a little bit worried about that hierarchical place they've had because they've had that mainstream coverage. That we now have a system, or social media, where pretty much anyone with internet access, like anyone at all, can have the exact same platform and opportunities. Now, of course, it's not so easy because I'll talk about this in the video, but the real cancel culture usually applies to whistleblowers, people of minority groups, etc. But it seems like a lot of these celebrity types are almost reacting to that as a sort of like oppression and a sort of civility politics thing, if that makes sense. The very notion of the idea, like, are we more angry? And then examining Twitter for anger, for example, and being able to do that as somebody who uses your platform as a branding opportunity. I don't know, something that I really took from this is this worrying move that I'm seeing, which is really dangerous. It's being perpetuated by the centre and by liberals with good intentions. I need to stress that I don't think the majority of these people have any bad intentions at all, but I think this is so manipulated by the right. It's the idea that anger and hate are the same. That people being angry or even sweary or frustrated on social media is the equivalent to harassment. And the very notion of politeness and all those kind of things, I feel like we need to be clearer on what we mean because I think different groups are using it very differently. Something that is said in the documentary, and I will talk about in more depth, is, for example, there's this one scene in the documentary where David Baddiel goes to this, I think it's a uni or something, and they've made a sort of like word wall thing of the most used words. I can't remember if it was by him or to him. And I don't want to say it because I don't want this video to get like taken down or something, but like the F word, for example. So it seemed very much optics driven. You know, this idea that in itself was a sign of hate and anger. I'm not saying it's okay to go around and swear at people, but the thing that I feel like this documentary was missing in a major way was the way that if we think like that, then we're going to have a situation where we're going to have politicians with real power, people with real power, people like Priti Patel, you know, people like Boris Johnson, all these people who are smart enough to cloak their bigotry and their harm in civility. Now, if well-meaning centrists are looking at trolls at a very basic level as people that are angry, that are loud, that might be sweary, right, that aren't detaching, that aren't applying that kind of academic, intellectual, let's have a debate attitude, if everyone like that is written off as a troll, then that's really dangerous, because essentially what that kind of idea leads to is the idea that you can actually enact policies, you can actually spread hatred that does kill, that genuinely harms very vulnerable people, as long as you're clever enough to do it in a polite way. And that's the issue I have. I talk about this all the time on this channel. I feel like the rise of the optics left, or the optics liberals, or the optics centrists, whatever that is, are taking us down a very bad path to the right. And I think, from the people that I saw in this documentary, I don't necessarily think it's this vicious thing. I think it's just this detached privilege. I definitely got the sense in this documentary that this was like a hobby, it was a pastime. I certainly noticed that obviously David Baddiel was talking about how, at one point in the documentary, he talks about how he decides to go cold turkey and not go on social media for a while. And he also talks earlier about how he uses it as a branding tool, so he makes jokes to get followers, and because he gets more followers, he can then sell tickets to his shows, etc. So for him, it's like a business opportunity. And that, for me, is also another fundamental misunderstanding, and why this issue is never really going to get anywhere, because we have to understand that people are using Twitter in different ways, depending on what they're doing. So a public figure like David Baddiel is probably going to be using Twitter, like he says very openly and honestly, as a branding tool. So he's there partly for fun, but also because he wants to build his audience, which is fine, that's his right. You know, that's something that social media does for people. But then you're also going to have people to which they're not using Twitter as a brand. So some people are going to be using it as a diary. Some people are going to be using it to express frustration or to make jokes with their friends. There's going to be community groups on Twitter. There's going to be different language, different rules for each group. And the way they strip out context worries me. I've said this millions of times before, but like, for example, imagine you have a very prominent transphobe spreading stuff about trans people or trans women that very literally is contributing to a culture where trans women are at risk, they're being attacked, extreme hate crime, suicide, all these things. And they're posting this stuff. Now, if you have the dreaded trans activists, I don't know, that's become a terrible term now, somehow, but if you have like a dreaded trans activist replying to that, or quote tweeting it with something like, well, F you, this is transphobic, it's ridiculous. Now, I really do think that in the minds of these people like David Baddiel, I think to them that would count as trolling, because it's angry. He says in the documentary about how trolls are trying to be the angriest for attention, right? So that they want an attention hit. He doesn't seem to be able to see past his own perspective of the way he uses it. So the way he uses it, which is fair enough, he's using it as a branding tool. So when he's using it, he is using it to get attention. And there's nothing wrong with that, but that's what he's doing because of his career. But a lot of these people, these kind of people who already have a sort of privilege and platform, don't seem to realise that for other people, that might be their only communication with others. If they're disabled, if they're mentally ill, there's going to be people in their ordinary lives who are going through really, really bad stuff, who are venting. Obviously, to oppressed and minority groups, these issues are going to create more anger. I talk about this all the time, but of course it's going to create more anger, and it would be really, really unfair of us to pretend that a minority expressing anger at somebody, at a public figure who is using their big platform to spread these ideas, and simply dismiss that as being a troll is too simplistic. So I have got some notes here, but sorry if I kind of go off on tangents. I just wrote some initial thoughts as I was watching it, because I knew I would think a lot about it. So the initial question that he was asking was, is social media making people more angry than ever and more polarised? And I guess my answer to that would be yes and no, because I think we can definitely see that we have companies like Facebook, different platforms, are deliberately playing on fear, so that they are literally using algorithms to create that. Because like the tabloids, you know, outrage, taking out context, making everything really, really black and white, activating the rage in people, the frustration, is going to get them clicks. It's going to be profitable for them. So that's a genuine thing. But the thing that I would question here is that it's not new. Because the tabloids already do this. The news itself, the BBC itself already does this. So if you think that, a lot of people will think that the BBC is impartial, but of course it's not. Nothing is impartial. Everything will have an agenda. I don't think it would be possible to really manage to have anything that was completely impartial. So the perspective I got, that the vibe I got, is almost at various points he and other people on the show were kind of wanting to go back to that time, you know, the good old days before that anger. But I would put the argument across that the anger isn't new. Now, of course, it's probably exacerbated by Tory rule, by the economic situation, all these different things. But I don't think it's new anger. I think it's just that because everyone can access it. In the past, these comedians and things, they probably would have had to deal with, you know, bad reviews and things, which, you know, obviously isn't very pleasant if you're an artist or you're a comedian or something. But they wouldn't really have had people speaking back to them. And something that a lot of them give off, which worries me, and I don't think they even realise, is that that time period before social media was not fair and equal to begin with. Because it's actually a good thing that just any person can respond or refute and have that opportunity to make that connection, because that's what the internet can do for us. And obviously it can be used in a really bad way, because you can get harassment, you can get like hatred, and obviously it's a very interesting situation with David Baddiel, and I will talk about this more, but he obviously does face, he's obviously openly Jewish, so he's going to be getting a lot of very open, vicious anti-Semitism. Like he's going to be aware of that, so he's probably going to already have that sort of, I was going to say paranoia, but it's not really paranoia because it is a thing. So he's going to be dealing with that stuff. So in that sense, I can completely understand what he's saying, because I think that there really isn't enough crackdown on hate speech and those kind of things. I don't believe in the whole taking away internet anonymity, because I think that vulnerable people need to use it, like people in abuse situations, LGBT people who aren't out, you know, things like that. I think that's important. But I do think the police need to do more about, like, they have laws already about harassment, malicious communications, all that kind of thing. And it's very interesting that they never usually use that when it comes to the people that need it the most. So you'll often see that kind of thing weaponised by big people with big platforms and a lot of money who can take the stuff to court. And you've seen a lot of that stuff happening quite recently, where you'll see just like a random Twitter user that obviously offended like a big person, and they almost come down like a medieval monarch. They bring the whole thing and they're like, right, gone. And it does feel quite like an abuse of power the way it's applied. But alongside the fact that obviously David Baddiel's going to get a lot of very open and awful anti-Semitism simply because he's a Jewish man online who speaks openly about being Jewish. I also found, and I have found before, because I have seen him on Twitter before, I see a lot of stuff about him on Twitter sometimes, and I do find that a lot of the time, the criticisms he receives are more to do with him being either privileged and kind of detached. You know, obviously he went to like private school, he's quite, I would say he's quite like central politically. A lot of his stuff in the past, like obviously there was the blackface in the past, he does address this in the documentary. And there was something quite recently actually that was going around after this documentary about how he was speaking about how he'd bullied somebody as a child. And I don't hold that against a child, because obviously, you know, children can be awful, like it's not right, but you know, you don't hold it against a child. But as a 28-year-old man, he'd written, I don't know if it's an interview or in a memoir or something, he was still laughing about how he knew that this little boy's mother was dying, and it was funny, and he'd continued to use it in his sketches, like he'd made a joke out of it in a comedy sketch as an adult, even though this poor guy's sister got in touch and said, look, our mother was dying, it was really upsetting, I'm so glad he's not in the country, why did you use his real name in this? And he I don't know, it's just really disturbing, because he's older than me now when he wrote that, and it just worries me, because I just think most people, you know, I know that a lot of us have acted in ways that we weren't proud of when we were kids, when we were teenagers. But I would hope that once we got to adults, if we were to look back on that stuff, it would be with shame and with regret. And it certainly wouldn't be a joke. It certainly wouldn't be something that you then use like as part of your comedy career, like as a joke, making money out of that. The very idea of that, like, obviously his behaviour in the past has been the behaviour of a bully. Like what happened with the blackface with the footballer. And I've heard that apparently he actually hasn't apologised to that footballer yet, although he has apologised and said he understands the harm of using blackface and all that kind of thing. I do think he has a point in terms of, and I'll get to this later, I'm sorry I keep saying that, but I've got so many notes, about how in a lot of ways I don't think accountability culture, as he calls it, does necessarily always allow for growth and redemption and changing. I do agree with that point. But it just kind of didn't make much sense to me, because on the one hand, what it came across like is somebody that doesn't like bullying when it's against them, but if it's against someone else, they don't mind, if that makes sense. There was a comedian, let me find his name, I didn't know who he was. Right, so they showed a clip of a comedian on, I think it was Have I Got News For You? So that's on the BBC. And there was a joke somebody made. It wasn't really much of a joke, I don't think. And the joke literally tries to link Jeremy Corbyn to Nazism and supporting Nazis. Now, to me, it didn't make sense to put that in the documentary, because until that point, it had seemed very much a sense of, you know, power shouldn't be abused. Like, it should be that there should be accountability. People should be able to talk back. And it almost felt like David Baddiel's personal feelings here trumped the point he was trying to make. Because the very notion of being on a public platform like the BBC, which, you know, goes into everyone's homes, being able to make a claim like that, but not be able to have someone refute that. And in fact, this comedian then started talking to David Baddiel about how he felt he'd been cancelled for it, and he couldn't make jokes anymore. Which again doesn't make any sense, because I'm literally watching him on the BBC right now. I've seen him make the joke again, and I've seen him be in this documentary as a sort of victim. Oh, his name's Phil Wang, I think. And the way David Baddiel described it was, what was it he said? He said he attracted the wrath of social media for a joke. But again, that shows that he hasn't actually learned, because I mean, it's like the thing with the kid at school. It's like the thing with, I think it's Jason Lee. I'm sorry, I'm not into football, so the footballer. It's like that. It feels like it's missing this piece, because it's coming from this position of someone that doesn't like to be called out and doesn't want people doing that to them, but also wants to be able to do it to other people. Like, what's the standpoint? I didn't get it. You know, associating someone with Nazis is just bizarre. To do that, first of all, it wasn't a funny joke. It was bizarre, and like, it wasn't based on anything. Like, obviously the intention was to make somebody who can't actually reply in that moment seem like something which is horrific, because being pro-Nazi is sick, it's evil. And to imply that, they talk in this documentary about, you know, the harm caused to people. David Baddiel's own daughter is very brave, and she speaks about how she suffered with an eating disorder, and how social media for her made that worse. But then in the same programme later on, he's trying to then argue, because of his own personal feelings towards Jeremy Corbyn, that sort of thing, which genuinely, especially if we look at like the way that the hatred towards MPs in this country. And to my personal feeling on this is that it's fine to be angry with MPs, but I don't think there should be violence enacted on them. And something I find very worrying that the Tories are doing, and other politicians too, is they're almost starting to try and change things so that anger and calling out politicians amounts to hate and harassment and like, oh, it's bad. And it's just a silencing technique, that's all it is. Like, it's fine to be angry with politicians, I do think that. But obviously, I mean the basic, I think any of us, if we turned on the BBC and we were being accused of supporting Nazis, and it was a joke, I think most of us would think, well, that's off, right? That's weird. That's a misuse of power. That's a misuse of a platform. Like, by all means, of course, discuss feelings on stuff, issues, like, of course. But that was lazy. And then you've got this whole segment in the documentary, and I'm not sure which one of them said this, but one of them said, I do worry where a comedian makes a joke and his life is threatened, that it might make you think twice before you make another joke like that. And that was a weird thing to say, because I agree, your life shouldn't be threatened, absolutely. But also I think you should think twice before making a joke like that. Because to me, I think that was quite unacceptable. I don't think it is right to just call any random person a Nazi, like, on the BBC. Especially when someone's already, you know, being targeted as things like terrorist sympathiser and all that stuff. Like, we're all adults, we can see that's real world harm, and in some ways that's worse than trolls. Because sometimes, you know, trolls are usually, they don't have a big following, and, you know, they don't often have a lot of power. But this is actually using that privilege of being on the BBC, using that. Not only to say it, but now to then play victim about it. And it doesn't make sense. And then it goes into the jokes we've lost, the comedy we've lost is unquantifiable. But it isn't, because first of all, I've just heard that joke again on the show. There seems to be this weird idea that edgy comedy gets you cancelled. But it doesn't. So I understand. If you're a comedian, I would assume, anyone really, like as a writer, as me as a YouTuber, if I put content out there publicly, then I expect that There may be people who disagree with me, who want to refute my ideas, who don't like me for what I stand for, and that's fine. As long as they're not actually harassing or threatening me, that's part of the freedom of speech. Like, they can do that. It would be like me making a video that people didn't agree with on this channel, which has happened before loads. And then people in the comments, like, talking about it and saying, I don't agree with that, I think that's awful, that's messed up, and it was like a big thing. That wouldn't actually be me being cancelled or silenced. That would be me putting something into the public arena and for other people to be saying their thoughts. And I'm not saying it's okay to send threats or anything like that, but the way they were talking about this, it almost felt like they were sort of trying to say, oh, our livelihoods are threatened. And it's just the same old, every single generation. I think people don't realise. Like, it would be like stuff that we find really appalling now. So, for example, like, you know, David Baddiel talks about how he does regret the blackface. But by that logic, before, when he first did it and people were calling him out, it seems that the attitude would be, oh, you can't make comedy anymore, I'm being silenced, it's cancel culture. Obviously society's moved on, that now the centrists, who at the time would have been okay with it, are now saying, because it's like more popular and you can't really get away with it so much, they're like, oh yeah, it was bad, I shouldn't have done it. I just think a lot of these people are so privileged that they think that being responded to is a form of attack. That they shouldn't have it. I mean, if you think about the comedies that we grew up on, I mean, in our country we had Little Britain, and it was classist, homophobic at times, transphobic, racist, full of blackface. This was mainstream, okay? And both of the guys involved, and fair enough, they might have completely changed, and I do believe people can change and grow, but they still have very successful careers, both of them. They're doing really, really well. They're not cancelled. I mean, if you think about, like, people like Ricky Gervais talk about this all the time, about being cancelled, and yet they're making more and more comedy specials. It's just, it's really deceptive, because I think they know, because they're clever, that actually that's a new way to brand yourself. It's a new way to brand yourself as the edgy comedian, because if you go into the I'm being cancelled, you actually get a bigger platform. Now, of course, the people that actually are being cancelled, it's often notable that people talking about being cancelled are often, like, guys. They're usually white guys, straight guys, usually, not always, but they might come from, like, a middle class background, private school, all that kind of thing. And I think at some level that they're used to just seeing themselves as the reasonable people, like the people who set the reasoned debate standards. Any other suggestions from anyone seems to them like something radical, I think. I think they fear the uplifting of others, meaning that they have to come down, which I don't think they do have to. But if you think about the real victims of cancel culture, will be people who are like for example, there are going to be so many people in this society right now who are losing opportunities. So for example, I'll use the idea of trans women of colour especially. That's a real sort of cancel culture, because they're not even able to, I mean, on this very documentary, if you're studying the idea of cancel culture or accountability culture in social media, the massive gap in this show. Well, the two of the people that he interviewed, 3 in fact, that were like victims of cancel culture, and actually in some instances, like there was a family who did TikTok, their house had been like burned or something. It was horrific. But again, this is a white family with a platform, which does not make anything that they got okay. But what I'm saying is that they're now being asked to go on the show. So they are. It's not some sort of privilege, because what happened to them is disgusting. But they're able to talk about it right now, so it is being talked about, and that they are able to have that platform. He speaks to like a white, I think she's like a lifestyle blogger or something, and she's worried that she's an influencer, and there's a site that logs what influencers do, and I don't know if it's a good or a bad site. I don't know. Maybe it's holding her to account, maybe it's just nasty. I'm not sure. But these are the people he's talking to as the victims, and also that comedian guy, who was literally on Have I Got News For You. But the real people who are actually suffering from this, they aren't on it. And that's the point. Because these people's careers really are over. Like, they talk, they won't be centrist. So they'll go a bit further left, and they'll be deemed dangerous, radical, and they'll be written off. Trans women, black women showing any form of anger, too angry, off they go. They're not liked because of the tabloids and the news. Whistleblowers, I mean, how many... we don't even know about the extent of whistleblowers, because I don't even think we probably get the tiniest percentage ever of the real cost of this, because there are going to be so many whistleblowers, so many, that don't even get to a point where we even know who they are, because they don't have a platform. You know, he didn't go and talk to someone like Diane Abbott about the intense racist, sexist abuse. You know, he didn't go and talk to trans people, the people that were so directly impacted. And it just made the documentary feel dodgy to me. Because it was presenting itself as this, like, intellectual roundup. It was trying to do a bit of a Louis Theroux, but it didn't achieve it. It was more of a character study of centrist, middle-class, quite privileged people in the media and how they react to it. So it was an incredibly valuable show in that regard. It was almost a bit funny to watch that because it was such an incredible study of, you know, the way that they were chatting about it. It was like they decided themselves that they were the reasonable people here. And oh gosh, some people get too angry and too shouty, and they're all trying to shout very loudly, and it's all very, very unpleasant. You know, they interviewed Caitlin Moran on there, and actually, and I don't doubt, you know, she will get a lot of sexism stuff because she's an outspoken feminist. I don't like her feminism because I used to when I was younger, but then I realised she's not intersectional. Like, it feels very privileged, and I almost feel like at this point, what's the point of being a feminist if you're not an intersectional feminist? Like, I've noticed that so many people that I admired as feminists were only feminists because they cared about themselves. And that's distressing, because you think, don't you, that people are going to stand behind an oppressed group because they care about oppression. But you start to realise when these people become successful, they split into two groups. So you have the people that become successful and still continue to stand with oppressed groups, even groups that are nothing to do with them. And then you get others who suddenly get successful and they want to, like, assimilate with everyone else, and it doesn't matter, and they'll even throw other groups under the bus. I'm not going to name names, but I'm sure we can all think of a couple of those right now. And I think it is really notable, something that I did think of here, is I was thinking about David Baddiel as the presenter of this, you know, as the guy guiding us through this. And how it was very, very clear to me that I don't think he's a bad guy or anything, but I think that he comes from this, he obviously went to private school, so he was quite, you know, it's a different world. It's a world where they tend to value, and I can say this as someone who, one half of my family are working class immigrants from India, the other half are like, they were working class, and then my granddad is a doctor and my grandma was like a teacher, and so they kind of lived like a more middle class life and like presenting a very middle class face to the world. So I've kind of existed in that weird space between those two very, very different worlds, because my mum and dad are divorced, so it's like, they're different worlds to me. And I really could see the same stuff that I see in the middle class part of my family, who I love very much, but it seems to be that they're so focused on manners, on things like grammar and politeness and decency, like seen to be decent, but that stuff trumps justice a lot of the time, because they've learned, it's like table manners. It's like, oh, you're rude because you put your elbows on the table, but it's fine that you sat there and started a dinner conversation about how you thought refugees should drown because you did it in a polite manner. It's so optics driven, and I think it's actually, this documentary's probably done more harm than good, because it's come from that standpoint. Apart from, obviously, if people are looking at it, and I'm sure probably some people looked at it the same way I did and saw that stuff. But I don't know. There was an instance, forgive me if I'm wrong, like I do have ADHD myself, and that is part of this as well, because obviously, like, when you think about how different people use Twitter, like, it does give you a dopamine rush. They did a brain scan in the show that was really interesting about how negative stuff seems to give you like a fight or flight response. You know, it literally gives you that response. But positive stuff gives you a dopamine kick. And in that way, I think people can be very manipulated by social media. It can be very seductive. I think especially for people like ADHD, like myself, like, it does give you a kick. It gives you that community. It gives you that sense of, you know, something. But I think I remember he was on, I don't know if it was like a news show or something, and he was talking about trolling and the stuff that he got that was like, that he found to be trolling and unacceptable, and they put tweets on the screen and he was talking about how bad he thought it was. I'll put this on the screen if this is a thing, I might be completely wrong, but I'm pretty sure that once he figured out that it was actually like a blue tick, like it was a fellow hierarchy, like it was a famous person, right? It was an important person. All that stuff he'd said about the tweet changed, and it was no longer like a troll tweet to him, and that was so revealing because the tweet hadn't changed. All that had changed in his mind was the person who had written the tweet. So that immediately showed me that the problem for these people is not actually necessarily the tweet. It's who gets to say it. It's who gets the platform. So it was valid to him because it came from, it comes from like a colleague, you know, someone who's in the public eye, you know, someone important, not a little person. These angry little people coming out of nowhere. You know, it did bug me that there was that sense of, oh, if only we could go back to a time when there wasn't so much anger. But the anger's always been there. It's just that these people haven't had to know about it. Of course it's different to them and it inconveniences them. Where are they ever going to have heard that before from ordinary people? So sometimes you're going to get people from minority groups who, you know, by luck and hard work might make it into the media. So you might get those people who are journalists and who do speak and do get these platforms. The majority of normal people just didn't have a platform before social media. You wouldn't know what they thought. These comedians and stuff, they wouldn't get that feedback. And I think something they liked is the sense that they would be able to make these jokes and be able to feel like everyone loved it and that they were so funny and they didn't have to question it. I don't necessarily think... Well, I do think the world is getting more angry in the sense that the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. Like, there's a lot more hatred towards minority groups, vulnerable people. But again, that's where it's happening. So yeah, like, you've got the new Nationality and Borders Bill. You've got the police bill, you've got the new Bill of Rights, which sounds absolutely terrifying. And yet, even with this platform now, the show that he's got, he's chosen to focus on the impact on fairly privileged people, you know, people who aren't necessarily in minority groups or suffering from that, who do have a platform. He's chosen to focus on that. Even that choice says something. Because yes, there is this increase in anger, but where is it really, really doing the most harm? So at the moment, I'm seeing trans people towards immigrants and refugees. Like, it's because the tabloids and the media, they all play into it. And there's this lack of acknowledgement in this whole documentary. The time before, this fabled time of fairness before the internet, people were still angry about injustice, they just couldn't talk about it. The tabloids still existed. Like, so the tabloids were doing that very thing. The newspapers were doing that very thing. Every platform was. And these people were complicit because they were on these shows, right? They were still part of that. I think they like to think that they didn't have an agenda. They're like these good, moderate people who are just coming at an issue. But we all have an agenda. None of us are unbiased. You know, I think Caitlin Moran said something about... I wrote notes here. She said something about, like, social media is like... You see a lot of anger, like kids having a tantrum. And I think that bugged me because I've seen a lot of this stuff. I don't follow her anymore. But a lot of the stuff that she used to get angry at would be like women of colour trying to address her liberal feminism. Not in a way that was rude. And, you know, there's so many layers to this. Like, the way they are able to now they are able to use their power to, first of all, be on this show and present themselves as victims somehow. Which would be unthinkable to most people because... For example, if I had been approached to go on a show like that, and David Baddiel had asked me about my experience, I think what I would actually say is I would talk about what it was like to be, you know, a feminist, bisexual, biracial, you know, all those different things. But I'd also want to say that actually it's really important that we talk about the very, very, very vulnerable communities, like, for example, the trans community. Like, I would want to talk about that because those are the places where this idea of, like, oh, everything's so polarised and angry, it's an inconvenience to these people, but it's not their lives. It's not their lives. They're able to use social media as a game or as a career. They can step away from it. But for other people, it's literally their lives. You know, we all come at social media from a different standpoint. Some of them use it as branding, and they see it as branding. And this is something that people, like, for me personally, as someone who is a YouTuber, you know, it's weird, but obviously I have ADHD anyway, and I have BPD as well. So I get all sorts of moods. So on my Twitter, sometimes I'm talking about mental breakdown, like sometimes I'm very emotional, sometimes I've gone very academic. Like, it's a huge mixture of things. We are all in different spaces, using different tones in different communities. And I just feel so lazy, like this whole blanket thing about, oh gosh, everyone's getting so angry with each other, and I wish we could simply listen to each other. And it's just like so surface level. It's like primary school stuff. I think it was David Baddiel that said this. He said, everything you tweet on social media, you're running an instant opinion poll, whether you like it or not, on how this opinion goes down. But isn't that life? Am I going a bit mad here? Like, that is life. It's like if you were out with people and you said an opinion, someone who was around you might say, oh, I disagree with that. Some of these quotes just, they betrayed something more than what was being showed to me. They didn't seem to fit the narrative that was supposedly meant to exist. And again, it's a really privileged position because I think these people aren't used to it. I don't think they get it. Like, I've obviously been on YouTube since I was about 19, talking about feminism. And I've known, as a woman, as a mixed race person, as a bisexual, that everything I've had to do, I've had to preempt. And if at any point that I've done anything on impulse, it's the intense scrutiny is insane. And you're already having to preempt things, but you know that anyway. Like, so if you're in that position, you already know that if you're going on social media, if you put something out there, people are going to respond. And usually if you're in a minority or vulnerable group, it's going to be really difficult. I mean, I've spoken about this so many times before, but when I was on the official Doctor Who Time team, for example, a tweet was flagged up from like 2013 or something, and I had tagged a sarcastic tweet with hashtag ooh and hashtag straighties or something like gross. Now, the context of that was that it was literally a joke, because I was, obviously, the community I was part of was LGBT. We were experiencing a lot of, at the time I was getting death threats, really bad homophobia, like sick, awful stuff all the time. And there was this pervasive attitude around like the idea of like gay people on TV and on adverts, and everyone using slurs for gay people or lesbians, and then saying like ooh or gross or acting like it was disgusting. So as like a joke, like in context, we would laugh together, and we would always point out how stupid it was, because sometimes like if there was like an advert with straight people and people had kicked off recently about one with gay people, we'd do something like, oh no, not a straight couple on the Shreddies advert, ooh, disgusting, oh those straighties. Like, so that was a thing. And when I was on the official Doctor Who Time team, and this was associated with the BBC, so it's kind of relevant, that was flagged to me, right? So that was flagged to me. Now this is the sort of thing, I made another video about this recently. And remember, I'm probably in quite a privileged position as well, but these people, they get very pedantic over, I don't know, it's weird, because people like David Baddiel are talking about how they get frustrated that they feel that their stuff is taken out of context, when I don't actually think it necessarily is. I mean, I think the blackface he did was always racist, it was always blackface. I know he accepts that now. But you know, it's not taken out of context. You know, it is in context. Definitely there's a conversation to be had, and I hate this too, about the fact that we don't necessarily always allow for growth. I think it's very, very important to see, you know, if a person can change, if a person can grow, and it's a really, really good thing if someone comes out of a bad mindset, is able to demonstrate the change, not just say it, but demonstrate it, and use that to educate other people. That's fantastic. Like, that is a really, really good point. But, you know, he seemed to be saying about all this stuff about, oh, you know, you get taken out of context, and I'm just wondering, well, where? What do you mean taken out of context? It doesn't actually make sense. You know, if this was a documentary that was going to be made, and it's a good idea to make this documentary, like why were those the focus? Like, why were those groups the focus? Because surely, like, you know, if you were going to look into this kind of thing, wouldn't it be relevant to like talk to someone like, for example, a trans woman of colour who would have a situation where everything they tweeted is going to be viewed through a lens of racial bias, through transphobia. So they might be seen as too angry because they're black, or they might be seen as because they're angry about transphobia, they're being taken out of context. They are then being portrayed as the angry black woman, or even they're being portrayed as a man because some people associate aggression with men. So, you know, that's an interesting conversation. Go into the minority groups. How can the conversations between minority groups, those communities that popped up, those people need to be protected, because they're the ones at risk from this. I know, for example, when I was on the team, many of the white professionals in the Doctor Who fandom and stuff are always tweeting edgy stuff. Some of it quite sexist, some of it quite racist, but that was fine. But if you're from one of those little communities, the scrutiny's so much that you'd be being, like, called out on something that by any reasonable standards, it was just an optics thing. It's just optics. And that's where this documentary just lost me. It felt like on the one hand he was arguing that like we need to look at context more and we need to think about things, and on the other hand he's defending someone who's literally associating Jeremy Corbyn with being a Nazi on the BBC. I don't quite get it. The only thing I can quite understand is that this is a person who doesn't like to be called out. He doesn't like it when it happens to him and people like him, like private school people, like those kind of people, but it's fine if it happens to others. There was also this really bizarre section as well. I will end this in a second. But, you know, he talks about social media or Twitter being used as an attempt to get recognised by attaching yourself to a tribe or a cause. And on the screen he puts, like, there's Trump badges and the label intersectional feminists and stuff. And I actually think that he again reveals something. This is so interesting psychologically, a great study of centrists who are quite privileged. Because immediately his mindset in that is that it's a branding technique, that people are doing it for attention, that people are using it to build their brand, because that's, it's so fascinating, because if you're interested in psychology and projection, so much of what these people say on this show reveals themselves by accident. It almost unmasks them by mistake. So I am an intersectional feminist, but that's because those are my principles, and I might put that on my profile so that people know that's what I am, so that people aren't going to like follow me, see me tweet about intersectional feminism, and then send me hate and abuse. It also is a sign of solidarity to show other people, like obviously for example, I'm a cis woman. I'm mixed race, but I'm white passing, but I want to show that, like, don't worry, I'm not like a white feminist, I'm not like a lib fem, like, I believe in fighting the inequality, like, I believe in intersectional feminism. That's the sort of feminist I want to be. But the way he was presenting that as like a tribe, like people just doing it for show, for branding, because in his head that's how he sees his social media. It couldn't be clearer that these people are using it for branding. They're using it for branding, getting annoyed when people who are using it as a personal tool are getting annoyed because the content is something that is offensive to them in their personal lives. But then suddenly they don't want to be like the big brand anymore, and they want to like suddenly be all protected. So do you want to be a public figure, or do you want to be one of everyone else? It doesn't make sense. Like, pick one. If that's what you want to be, if you want to be a leader of debate, if you want to be, you know, political, that kind of thing, then you have to accept that that's going to happen. Like, that has to be, that's a thing, isn't it? That's free speech. No, it's fine. It's fine if you just want to be a brand, if you just want to make your jokes, if you don't want that criticism, that's fine. But then you have to accept that you can't then frame yourself as some sort of victim of cancel culture. Because you're taking that role, you are using your privilege, you have a platform. I mean, he says here, sorry if that didn't make much sense, but he says here that, like, he says everyone's trying to broadcast who they are at the same time. And again, it's so fascinating because I'm so interested in psychology, I'm so interested in projection. And it's this thing that you see time and time again in psychology, in terms of abusive dynamics, oppressive dynamics, not necessarily with bad intentions. These people it couldn't be clearer that they're viewing it as a competition. They're viewing it as scales. One goes up, one has to go down. Everyone's trying to broadcast who they are at the same time, and he presents that like it's a problem. Like, only a certain amount of people can do that at the same time. Like, for him to broadcast who he is, other people mustn't. So much of this documentary reveals so much of a very centrist mindset. It's fascinating. So I would really, really be interested to know if you've seen it. You might be interested in watching it, because not for the reasons that they intend, but it was fascinating to me, like, as a study. It was so interesting. You know, he also argues that, like, people deliberately get angry and angrier online as a ploy to get more attention from people. And he discounts the fact that actually marginalised people are probably going to be more angry anyway. Of course. And then he also says this bizarre thing. He says, one way to do that, as in to get attention, is shouting at someone who infringed your identity, because anger confirms your identity. And that, honestly, that's alien and bizarre. Like, I don't think most people have that mentality. I think that's his mentality. It's fascinating, because I'm hearing this stuff said to me by these kind of centristy figures. Like it's this wisdom that everyone knows. And I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, I don't recognise that. That's not... I think they think like that, so they think it's normal because they talk among themselves about it, but I don't think that's how most people think. I don't use anger to confirm my identity. The people I see don't... It's survival for people. Why would I need to use anger to confirm my identity? I think they talk themselves into it. It's almost like they're talking themselves into a way of... They want to be good people. They don't want to be too progressive because they don't want to take the risk, even if they might feel it. They want to be dignified. They don't want to be a victim of what the real cancel culture is, which is what happens to people that are too progressive. Right? They don't want to be that. They want to be seen as good people, but they don't necessarily want to, like, get in the trenches. You know, they don't want to do that. In fact, they'll throw people under the bus who do get in the trenches to raise themselves. Because in their minds, these people can't all flourish at once. It's got to be only a few at a time. And I think they convince themselves to keep hold of this fiction that they're good moral arbiters of what is the centre and the decency of life. You know, what's the established, mature wisdom. You know, we're all very mature here. We're all grown adults, right? We got this right, haven't we? They can't let another mindset in, so it's almost like they're making up stuff. They're seeing anger from people. They don't want to think, oh God, maybe I'm actually not as progressive as I thought. Maybe I'm actually a stumbling block here. Maybe I'm actually in the way of it. They don't want to think like that, but they don't want to move on either. So they have to say, well, maybe they're Facebook's doing it to people, and maybe these people are brand building, and maybe they just want attention, and maybe they're trying to shout at someone who infringed their identity because anger confirms their identity. And it's like, it's actually ludicrous. Some of this stuff I wrote watching it, I had to keep reading to myself in my head because it didn't make sense. And they're all talking about it like it does make sense. But it doesn't. Anyway, so hope you enjoyed this video. I don't know if you saw the documentary. Yeah, I'd be really interested to know your thoughts on this. Fascinating to me, absolutely fascinating. But yeah, I love you loads. And I'll see you really soon. Okay, love you, bye!